Hello. In this talk, I'm going to attempt to make sense of some of the changes I see underway in digital advertising and how we can nurture and support them into building a fairer future for our industry. I'm not going to dwell too long on why things need to change. We are dominated by some of the world's largest companies, and what we have today is dysfunctional. But thankfully, things are already changing for the better. What I am going to spend time on is what I see as some of the primary drivers behind that change in 2020. Propose a theme for the direction that I think it's taking us, and offer a rally cry to all the marketers out there who want to help build a fairer future. Before digging into what I mean by fairness, let's cover off the question of why we need change at all. Digital advertising is growing strongly. eMarketer estimates a COVID-adjusted growth rate of 15% year on year for 2020. So why don't we just keep doing what we're doing? Well, not everyone is growing, and not all growth is good growth. Let's look at it through the lens of users, advertisers, and publishers. I'll start with users. According to the Advertising Association, public favorability in advertising has almost halved, from 48% in 1992 to 25% in 2019. From this, the AA created the Trust Working Group with ISBA and the IPA. Their first action was to commission the biggest study into public trust in advertising. What were the takeaways for digital advertising? Users hate the intrusiveness, the bombardment, data exploitation, and fraud. What's interesting about the study was the headline statistics are terrible. But part of the study included video interviews with a number of people who participated in the study. The sentiment and tone towards advertising on the whole wasn't bad at all. In fact, there are many examples cited of really good and compelling advertising. It's the bad advertising that people don't like. So what are the consequences of all that bad advertising? Well, over a third of internet users now use an ad blocker. Safari and Firefox introduced tracking prevention in 2017 and 2018. And Google finally followed this year and put an end to the user level data we've all become hooked on, forcing a rethink on how we track, target, and measure the effectiveness of digital advertising, which is a good thing. And so we come to our first big driver of change in 2020, the death of the third-party cookie and tracking. A second big driver of change is data regulation, GDPR in the UK and Europe. Almost everyone's been consumed by the GDPR in the past 2 years, so I'm not going to say any more about it. So what about advertisers? Well, over 800,000 new companies that spend money on advertising have been created in the UK since 2003. Google and Facebook have created a whole new generation of internet-savvy businesses. So there are some real positives that come from programmatic advertising for advertisers. But what about the rest of the advertising market? What about the 15 brands that participated in the ISBA PwC report into the programmatic supply chain published earlier this year? What do they think? The average campaign in the study, this is not the worst, the average, ran on 40,000 websites, which leads to our next driver of change, brand safety. For all of the campaigns that were measured, only 12% of the impressions were measurable, which means our next driver of change, measurability. And of those that were actually measured, 15% of the advertiser budget just disappeared into the ether. We don't know where it went. Which leads to our next driver of change, transparency. The company I run, the Ozone project, we have a direct engagement with nearly all 13 of the brands who participated in the study, who, apart from being embarrassed that they don't even know the extent of the issue, are angry and frustrated at the negligence and structural failures in what is supposed to be an efficient marketing channel. And what then about the publishers? Did the promise of unlocking all those unsold impressions offset the decline in premium yields for publishers? Publishers today are operating in an advertising industry where two companies capture 90% of the total digital advertising spend and who don't actually publish content themselves, who've convinced regulators and tax officials that the rules that everyone else abide by do not apply to them. Of the remaining 10% of the digital spend, the news publishers I work with capture a little over 2%. And yet of the 45 million users of Google in the UK, the 44 million of Facebook and the 43 million of Amazon, the same news publishers have a higher readership with 45.1 million. The same reach with audiences and yet 1/40 of the revenue. Logic would dictate that this is what advertisers want, and that the tech platforms are driving 40 times the value of advertisers compared to the news publishers. As mentioned earlier, I think for smaller tactical advertisers, that's probably true. But for the remaining 55% of the ad market, the latest PwC ISBA report would indicate otherwise. I should point out here, I'm not trying to lay responsibility for the dysfunction we have today solely at the door of the platforms dominating 90% of our industry. Actually, quite the opposite, as you'll soon see. So what's the future? Well, it's at this point I want to introduce the concept of fairness. What do I mean by a fairer future? Why fairness? Well, fair is an interesting word. In general, it denotes balance. If something is fair, it's reasonable. It's what you might expect or deserve. Dig a little deeper though, and what fairness means depends on your perspective and the role you play in a system. To explain, I'm going to use fair trade bananas as an example. I'll caveat that I know nothing about the market for fair trade or bananas, so this is purely fictitious based on what I imagine is actually true. At some point in time, someone claimed that the market for bananas was unfair, and presumably that meant that banana growers were not fairly paid for their bananas, and that the value exchange between buyer, seller, and middleman was not balanced. So the concept of fair trade was introduced. Now, there are some important building blocks to fair trade. There needed to be a level of dissatisfaction with how things were to motivate change. There needed to be a different way of doing things that was well thought through and presented a compelling alternative. There needed to be information symmetry, a clear understanding of where value is captured. And with bananas, this meant auditing of supply chains and creating standards to define what's good and provide confidence in the concept of fair trade. And there needed to be education for buyers so that the banana purchaser, i.e. me, has sufficient understanding of the choice that I'm making between normal bananas and fair trade bananas. The last point is the most important point and comes back to my earlier point of fairness depends on the role you play in a system. If you are a supplier and you think the system is unfair, you want the buyer to know about it. But if you're the buyer, you don't want to be told what to do. You want information to be able to make an informed choice of your own. Information and education is key. So, can we apply the fairness concept to programmatic advertising? Well, a lot of the building blocks are there for fairness to exist. I think many of you can spot some of the biggest challenges. Is the level of dissatisfaction we have today sufficient to motivate change? Well, I think based on the drivers we've just discussed, with third-party cookies and tracking changes, data is disappearing. So we need to change whether we like it or not. And we need to rethink how we measure success. Again, this is a good thing. On top of that, we've got data regulation, brand safety concerns, measurability issues, transparency issues. No one wants to go back to a repeat of the ISBA PwC report. And finally, a poor value exchange. So do we have an alternative? Well, this is an interesting question. Maybe a better question for digital advertising might be, how do we know what good looks like? Well, we've got some great frameworks that are growing in popularity by the day. We've got the Attention Council, the Disinformation Index, ISBA's 5-point plan, all emerging concepts to point us in the right direction. Digital advertising has always operated in its own silo, with its own ad tech metrics that are not aligned to other media channels and often overstate their true value. It's for this reason I'm a big fan of Chrome discontinuing support for the third-party cookie, arguably the lifeblood of most of these metrics. It forces us all to rethink and think differently about how we define success, ideally to metrics that matter, that drive real business value rather than channel tactics. It's out of this forced change that alternatives will emerge, but they will almost certainly be alternatives where advertisers and publishers have a more direct connection to each other. Do we have information symmetry? Well, the PwC report ranked data maturity in our industry at somewhere between weak and average. For an industry dominated by 3 out of the 5 most valuable companies in the world, that doesn't really sound good enough. Without transparency in supply chains, distrust will continue and programmatic advertising will die on the vine. The alternative buyers will seek will just bypass the distrust, working directly with large publishers and aggregators such as Ozone at the expense of the broader market. And finally, to the last point, do buyers have the right information to make an informed choice? The banana fair trade people had to believe that enough consumers cared about the banana growers and where their money was spent. Otherwise, the whole concept wouldn't have worked. They tapped into the fact that I cared. In advertising, I don't think most brands have really engaged enough or cared about where their digital ads have appeared. They receive PowerPoint presentations from their agencies that had the usual premium publisher logos on it, generally news brands, and they never asked where the other 98% of their budget actually ran. But I do think this is changing, and changing quickly. Brands are increasingly realizing that this is not just a supply chain problem, and that they have to engage to solve these issues. And they are. Imagine a world where brands know where their ads actually appear, where their measures of success build real business value, where their suppliers are incentivized to support these measures of success, where supply paths are clear and transparent, where all the actors in the supply chain are fairly remunerated for the value they bring, and when vendors are working in the best interests of their customers and not the other way around. That's the world that I want to work in. It's one thing to talk about what needs to change, but it's another to believe that change is possible. And when I agreed to do this talk earlier in the year, COVID was barely in the news. Wow, how quickly things can turn upside down. And while the main driver of changes predated COVID, how we react to them can change quickly. And this is where I come to my final driver and the biggest driver of change, the COVID reset button. The unique aspect of the COVID crash for me is the protracted period of reflection. We were forced to change how we work with Zoom and Hangouts, where we work, at home, on sofas, in kitchens. COVID taught us that anything is possible and that if we have to change, we can. And if things need to be different, then they can be. And certainly for me, a reminder of why I do what I do, why I sit on 10 hours of Zoom calls each day. To quote Simon Sinek, what we do proves why we do it. I do what I do because I believe in a fairer future for programmatic advertising. In fact, I don't need to believe we can create change because with Ozone, we invoke change every day. Ozone doubled in size during lockdown, 100% quarter-on-quarter growth. Let me tell you how. I have an amazing team who have worked their bollocks off during COVID. And while they're tired and frazzled by trying to sell advertising packages from their bedrooms to agencies that are furloughed and clients that have pulled spend, or trafficking campaigns while juggling a 2-year-old on their lap, without exception, their commitment and motivation never once wavered. But why? Why are we so committed when in reality we're just delivering digital campaigns on premium publisher websites? The truth is we don't see it that way. We aren't just selling ads. We are creating a fairer future and believe that we can make a difference. Importantly, the buyers that we work with can see our commitment to change. They don't buy the ads we sell them. They buy why we sell them. What we do proves why we do it. And this is my call out to all those marketers out there who are listening and agreeing but not acting. Get off the fence, engage, ask questions, be curious, challenge. We can't build a fairer future without you. I believe you want to invest in a quality content world because society is a much poorer place without it. And investing in that world gives you purpose, and that is worth more than any ad tech metric you can measure. Believe that change is possible and it will happen. The world is moving online. This is about more than just advertising. We have a responsibility to build a fairer future, not just for advertisers and publishers, but for our customers, consumers, and society. I also believe it's got very complicated and serious. Let's move on from all the talk of brand safety, fraud, trust, transparency, and let's work together to build a fairer future and put trust, safety, and a bit of fun back into advertising. Thanks.